Hello, folks. Rory here, and welcome to another episode of the Love and Courage podcast. Before we get started with what is set to be a great conversation, I want to say a big thanks to all the podcast patrons who chip in on a once-off or a monthly basis over at loveandcourage.org. I really appreciate your support. It helps get the podcast out there, reach new listeners all over the world. You're obviously about to watch a video version of the podcast, but it is available on all the main podcast platforms, the audio versions on Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, Acast, so many and too many to mention. But if you go to the various podcast apps and look up Love and Courage, you'll find a great archive of conversations there. So my guest in this episode is John Connell. You may know John. He's an award-winning Irish author, playwright, journalist, and film producer. He's a native of County Longford in the Midlands, and he's from a rural farming background, something that I think has greatly and deeply influenced his work, his writing, and his thinking. And I'm sure we'll get talking about that in this conversation. So John also spent several years living and working in Australia, where he was a university lecturer. He was the founder of a media production company and also an award-winning investigative journalist. His last book you may have read, or certainly may have heard about. It was called The Cowbook. It was a #1 best-selling sensation. It spent 6 months in the Irish charts. And it's called The Farmer's Son in the US, for anyone that might be watching and listening in the US. John is currently busy working on his first TV drama production, and it features none other than BAFTA award winner Stephen Ray. And he's currently preparing for the release of his new book, which is called The Running Book. So keep an eye out for that, and I'm sure we will get to talk about that in this conversation. So we'll get started very soon, but I do want to say a big thanks to everyone who's been supporting my book, Hitching for Hope, A Journey into the Heart and Soul of Ireland, which came out earlier this year. It's part memoir, part hitchhiking travel adventure, part social history, and in many ways, it's a celebration of community spirit that explores the theme of hope in troubled times. So I suppose you could say it's particularly relevant to what's going on in the world these days. Hitching for Hope is available internationally on paperback, and it's also an ebook, and it's available as an audiobook through Chelsea Green Publishing. It continues to do well. It has, I suppose I won't lie, it has been a difficult time to release a book, but thanks to your support and people getting behind it and the great response from readers or reviewers, it has been doing well, and I've been going all around the country signing copies in bookstores. Sadly, my tours have been cancelled in the US, UK, and elsewhere, but I am about to start doing a virtual US book tour in association with various diaspora groups in New York and elsewhere. And I'll be doing something similar with groups in the UK, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. So if you're part of an association, a network, a book club, a library, a community group, a school, a college, a company, anyone that wants to hear more about the book and or have a talk, a conversation, a workshop on themes such as courage, connection, community spirit, and hope in troubled times, then please do get in touch. And I also want to say, before we get started, I want to say a big thanks to everyone who's left a review for Hitching for Hope on Amazon, Goodreads, and Google Books. As I say, the support is hugely appreciated. I don't take it for granted, and I'm still trying to get the book out into the world. So all support appreciated. If you want to get in touch, email info at hitchingforhope.com. All the information you need on the where to buy the book and the various bookshops and all the rest is at hitchingforhope.com. So back to this episode. Let's get started. Thanks for your patience. Let's jump into this episode of the Love and Courage podcast with John Connell. And if you do like it, please do share, comment, like, rate, review, all that kind of stuff. But most importantly, folks, just sit back and enjoy this conversation with John Connell. John, great to finally catch up on the Love and Courage podcast. Where are you joining me from? I've no idea. I think you might be in Longford, are you?
I am, yeah. I'm in rural Longford in a place called Lettergullion in Balnamuck, where the 1798 rebellion ended. So not at my house, but not far from it.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. I'm actually just back from Wexford, and the place is riddled with, in a positive light, with 1798 monuments. And I mean, it's just such a pivotal time in Irish history. I couldn't help think about it and its relationship to today. I don't know if that's where we want to go straight away, but certainly Irish history is never far away from us at all times, you know.
No, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I was up in Donegal at the weekend, and I was just reflecting on all the old cottages that were empty, and all the people that are no longer here, or from the past that are no longer here. And I suppose when you're on the West Coast, you kind of feel that a lot about the ghost at the table. I think Thomas Murray used to call them that when he went to America. But yeah, there's history is never far from us in this country. But I think that's a really good thing, because I think there's other cultures where I lived. I lived in Australia and I lived in Canada, and they're not in touch with their history at all. And in fact, in Australia, they have a thing called the History Wars, where certain histories about colonization aren't even taught in school. So I think it's really good that we know this stuff, because it kind of gives you a grounding in who you are. So
Yeah, yeah. And what was your first? I mean, you're a guy with many strings to your bow, and certainly a wide kind of consciousness of social issues in history. But was there a kind of something in your upbringing or education in particular that created that strand, or was it later on in life? Or
I suppose. Well, I came from a family that was political and always talked about politics, so that was good. And then I think really it began with, at least once a week, my parents would turn off the TV and we would all have a family discussion about whatever was happening in the world for a night. There'd be no TV and we'd just talk, and my parents would ask us our opinions, even though they were the opinions of children. And that kind of gave me a questioning mind. And I think as well, public service broadcasting at the time in the 90s, when I was growing up, RT were getting in some amazing programs from PBS and ABC in Australia and BBC. I didn't have the BBC, so we only got what was on RT, and that kind of opened up a real world and a real question to me about what was happening in the world. And yeah, it's just kind of informed who I've become as a person. But I would ground it all in those family conversations once a week.
And were these weren't pre-scheduled? You know, was it like your mother or your father just going, right, tonight's the night? Or?
Tonight's the night. Yeah. We would do that, and then we'd have a quiz about. Dad would be the quiz master and ask us just questions that were catered to all of our likings. But and yeah, they just. My parents were very forward-thinking people, just normal rural Irish people, but they were very forward-thinking in that respect. And my dad's sort of surrogate father, in a sense, was Senator Mickey Doherty, who was Albert Reynolds' advisor. So there was always talk of politics and history and current affairs from my dad. And I think my parents were probably, ahead of their time, really, in that, because I know that there are other families that, the conversation revolved around what was for dinner or what was on telly. So it was only looking back, those nights, of course, I'd be like, oh, I wanted to watch this particular thing, or I wanted to do whatever it was. But looking back on it, it was a great grounding in having discussions. And really, all my life, all I've been doing is having conversations with people, and constructive ones, and sometimes not constructive ones. But probably in grounding conversation was where I became an investigative journalist and filmmaker and stuff. So yeah.
And so obviously so much of your life has been about farming, and you've written about it extensively. But I mean, do you think that's ultimately in your bones? That's the thing that's rooting you, you're a land man.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I suppose to preface that, my grandfather was born in 1895, fought in the Rising, in the rebellion, in the War of Independence, and his father would have been born shortly after the famine as a tenant. So the hold of land was something that my father always talked about a lot, and still does. as having a footing on the earth. So that was
Yeah.
something that was always a part of me. And then I liked farming, and you know, I went away from it for a long time. But ultimately, as I said, you know, when the Cowbook came out, it was the cows that helped put me through school, and that was a big part of life. And you know, I was working on a farm today, so it still is, and it's kind of a part of who I am. And I suppose the Cowbook was a success because it was telling a story that was uh, generations old. I'm not the first one to tell this story. I'm just the first one in this generation to tell the story. But I can look back to Thomas O'Crohan's Island Men, or Peg Sayers, or any of the Blasket writers, or John B. Keane. You know, there's a long tradition of an examination of the rural mindset, and that's, I think, yeah, it's funny. It's still happening. You know, people say, "Oh, it's 2020. We're not talking about farming and the land in Ireland," but we are. You know, we're still fixated by this thing. So
yeah. And when you say it's not talked about as much or not explored as much, do you think that there's this kind of conscious industrialization, urbanization? Have you felt that in your own life? Like, do you feel like you're part of that kind of last of the Mohicans generation, or has every generation felt that?
No, I think, you know, it's something I've thought about a lot. I think every generation that ever existed thinks that they're at the height of modernity, and that, funnily enough, that this is the end of the world as well, and the world as we know it it cannot get any more modern, and we're destroying the world we live in. And I mean, these fears have existed for thousands of years. You know, it's never. This is it. Like, we've reached the peak, and we look back at the people before us as Luddites, and I think, in a respect, that we're kind of fixated with like, in this country, in the media, we're fixated with the death of rural Ireland, as we are fixated, as America is fixated with the death of rural America. But rural communities continue to exist, and the industrialization of Ireland, I suppose I would call it an urbanization of Ireland, but certainly, yeah, we're a more urban country now. There's more people living in urban environments than there are in rural environments in Ireland. And an urban environment can be described as a town in a rural county. So I suppose James Rebanks, who wrote The Shepherd's Life, talked about it as this: that in schools in rural areas, you're taught to get an education, to get out, so you don't have to be working on the land. And in a sense, a lot of the young men and women who end up in farming are actually just rebelling in that system, or they're saying, well, actually, I do want to do this, but they're being guided to agriculture college, which is a good thing. But it's kind of like the enclosures of the English farms a long time ago. They want to get people off the land, but ultimately, that's the thing we're probably all going to have to come back to in some respect, with the changing climate that we're in. And funnily enough, COVID has proven that the industrial model necessarily doesn't work, because if we can't live as communities in cities, people are now returning to live in rural communities to work. If they have broadband, they can work. And talking to local real estate auctioneers, they're telling me they've never been busier, because there's people moving out of Dublin to move back to the countryside. So it's an interesting moment of flux, because a city can't be a city anymore. So we're questioning our relationship around the world, not just in Ireland, but around the world, to urban built environments.
Yeah, I guess the potential is there for a new rural reality, whereby I think broadband being one of the key, like the fact that actually, well, I'm in the rural west of Ireland as I speak to you, in rural Longford in the centre of Ireland, and this video and this podcast can be going out all over the world. So us rural men essentially are connected, but we can still be rooted in place. And I suppose that can be an interesting thing, whereby the local and the global might be able to coexist to some degree, rather than be one or the other.
Yeah, before we didn't have that choice, but I think broadband has changed that. We recently got broadband in the house, and it's I mean, I was running multiple projects from my kitchen table here for the last 2 years off my phone, and tethering off my phone and talking with people in LA and New York and London, and sometimes I kind of marveled at that, and now I have broadband. I can do it even faster,
Yeah.
so I
Even,
think,
yeah.
yeah, we're at an amazing moment, and you know, as much as the world is kind of scary at present, there's a lot of positivity and a lot of things to be thankful for. And I know in my own life, my wife was working in Dublin, and we were living apart, and COVID has actually brought us together, and she's able to work from home. And I know most of her colleagues feel the same, that why would we ever go back to, commuting for 2 hours a day, or 3 or 4 hours a day in some cases, when we can do all this work. And really, it was never about the employees. It was about the employers not trusting their workers to do their job. And it took a pandemic around the world for employers to go, actually, I can trust these people to do their job, and funnily enough, they're doing a better job from home.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so there's a trust thing there, that I suppose, the traditional 8-hour workday, um, uh, workers were never trusted to perform their jobs if they weren't at their desk. So now we've had a paradigm shift, and there is a trust being built now anew, and I think it's remarkable.
Yeah. Can you take me back a bit, John? Just to go back to those kind of youthful years of the young man leaving the land, and where you ended up, and what were your dreams?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I always wanted to be a writer. I had an interest in I was in school and I had an interest in that. It was either study law or do writing. And as it happened, my mother kind of advised me. She was like, well, maybe you'd consider studying journalism, because I could get a job in that. And that was kind of a really great decision that I didn't make myself, but that kind of altered my life. So I left Longford, went to Dublin to study at DCU, which I didn't find a very good university at all, actually, and didn't particularly like Dublin. But the most a positive thing that happened there was and one of the reasons I took the course was it was a 6-month year semester abroad where you could study in another country. And as it happened, I wasn't there that day, but my name was pulled out of a hat to go to Australia, and ultimately altered the whole course of my life. Um, I went to Australia. I was there for 6 months, got very involved in journalism. I had been working as a music journalist, and I wasn't an investigative journalist at all. And I got very involved in Indigenous affairs over there. Got really, really excited by it. And there was a thing called the Northern Territory Emergency Response, which was happening at the time that I had just went to Australia, which was kind of an encroachment by government into Aboriginal communities, and they were taking children away, a little bit like the Stolen Generations again. And I got a scholarship to go back to Australia, and I stayed there for another 6 months and went to the Northern Territory and lived in community with different nations of Indigenous people, and made a documentary about my time there. And ultimately, 6 months turned into 6 years. I was in Australia working as an investigative journalist, and it was really a fantastic time, and I loved it. And it's where I met my wife, and it's where I suppose I really blossomed as a person, because I think for me, living in Ireland at the time, I was always in the shadow of my brother or my father, and I was considered Tom Connell's son. Whereas I went to Australia, I didn't know anyone, and I got the opportunity to be John Connell. And that was a question that I'd never asked myself till I went there. And I remember walking down the street on Oxford Street in Sydney, one of the early nights. And I said, nobody knows you here. You've got an opportunity to become the person you want to be. And prior to that, I'd been quite shy and hadn't been that outward. And I kind of had a paradigm shift and just started being the person I wanted to be. And it was great. So travel broadens the mind. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's really true.
Mm. And that exposure to Indigenous Australia, was that something that you were consciously drawn to beforehand? Had you a sense of the injustice and the human rights issues, or was that a mind-blowing open moment for you?
I had known a little bit about the Indigenous situation, but not to the level of what I found. I suppose it really goes back to I've always had an interest in colonialism and post-colonialism, and that's coming from my father and the conversations we would have had on those nights when the TV were turned off, or any night in particular, and the effect of British imperialism around the world. And ultimately, that's what my new book, The Runner Book, is about. But I had known that Australia was a place of exile for the Irish, but also a paradise that had turned into a prison for the original inhabitants. And I suppose in learning about Indigenous culture, I did a course on it when I was in college, and got to know some Aboriginal people, and I have lots of Aboriginal friends now. I saw a reflection of Irish history happening right there and then. It was like turning back a dial a couple of hundred years to the 1700s and 1800s in Ireland, and seeing the dispossession and treatment of a people by a settler society, and the devastating consequences of colonization. And so in that, I just felt totally united with these people. And then, funnily enough, a lot of Aboriginal people have Irish blood, because when the Irish went there, they married Aboriginal women. And so you'd be talking to an Aboriginal person from New South Wales whose second name might be Murphy, and we're very aware and proud of their Irish heritage. So they were like our black brothers. And when I went to the Northern Territory, that was mind-blowing, because it was like going into a third world country, and also going into an apartheid state because of the racism directed from the white community at the Indigenous community. And I'd never seen racism like that. I'd certainly have, been aware of traveller issues in Ireland, but this was considerably worse. And although oddly the mortality rate and the disease profile that affects Indigenous people are the same that affect traveller people in Ireland. But the disdain that people had towards Aboriginal people was just shocking, And you could be talking to the nicest white Australian, and then you would mention an Aboriginal issue, and they just flip and just turn into a different person, and or just not care at all, which was kind of worse, that people didn't care. And I remember I was up there for a number of months making this radio documentary, and the biggest shock was actually flying back to Sydney and seeing all the wealth, all the the yachts, the boats, the apartments, the dinners out, and the lack of awareness of people to what was happening in their own country. And I remember when I'd made the documentary, kind of writing back to Ireland, to different people. I wrote to Senator David Norris, funnily enough, don't know why I wrote to him, but he said, "Oh yes, I'm very aware of this." And I said, "Well, we need to raise it in the Senate. We need to talk about this. We have bilateral relations with these people." But I was young and didn't realize necessarily how the world worked. But it left a mark on me that has stayed to this day.
Yeah. I remember I spent a fair bit of time in Australia myself, and I remember going to Canberra. My uncle was actually a senator in Australia for 19 years. So
wow.
Yeah, he was Cavan born guy, Jim McKiernan. He passed away a couple of years ago. And Jim was a serving senator, which is slightly different than a senator in Ireland. But
absolutely.
Yeah, him and his wife Jackie, I feel sorry for them in a way. They brought me to Canberra to go into the Parliament, which is a stunning Parliament.
It's beautiful.
Amazing. But my nose and my eyes were just drawn to the tent embassy. The Australian tent, the Aboriginal tent embassy was essentially a caravan and a little fire that was like a point of resistance. And I just remember going in there and meeting an old Aboriginal man and like just feeling like this was his land and this was this place. And I don't know, it shouldn't necessarily at this point be one or the other, but I think as Irish people, it's hard to ignore the parallels. And I think that's one thing we do have in common with so much of the world. And you can't ignore a contemporary understanding of the world without looking at history, which in essence, most of the world was colonized.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think it makes us any better in another sense, because if you take on, for instance, the views around travellers, they very much mirror some of the views that you've just expressed, and as does the life expectancy, imprisonment, you name it, the rates. So we have plenty to contend with at home, don't we? Before,
I think I always remember the Cowbook came about because I wrote a short story for Granta, which was based on a true story that my mother told me. She worked in the local county hospital in Longford when she was a young woman, and the story was true, and I just kind of fictionalized it a little bit. But she told me about a young traveller family who brought a boy in who was very sick, and one of her colleagues wouldn't treat him because he was a traveller, and the little boy was very, very sick. And I always remembered that as this point of resistance of, well, we're not going to treat you because you're a traveller. And that just stuck with me, and the dismissal. And I remember I was at a live theatre event a few years ago, and a woman got up and did a sort of a noble call, and she was a traveller, and she said, put up your hand if you've ever said anything negative about traveller people. And in fairness to the public, everyone put up their hand, and it was a real reality. But I suppose going back to, I think we were colonized, but I think actually we've been in such a race over the last number of decades to become a first world modern economy that we've actually forgotten the post-colonial conversation that we should be having with the rest of the world. And we have to have the conversation with ourselves first, particularly, like, as I say, about traveller people, but I think we also have to have the conversation with other countries who were colonized and who are coming to terms with their past, because we sort of have to have in Australia, they have a truth and reconciliation thing to start a conversation between white and Indigenous people about what has happened. And we were in such a race to escape poverty, which I understand, that we actually have never had that conversation with ourselves about what happened and how do we come to a point of healing from that. And in a way, it keeps cropping up. I mean, Boris Johnson is talking about, the Good Friday Agreement or the Anglo-Irish Agreement at the moment, and that's part of that conversation we're still not fully dealing with in this country. And there's a reticence in some respects to talk about it for fear that you are either seen as too nationalist or that, it's sour grapes, that's past, forget about it. But I think those conversations are really important. And I've worked with Indigenous people in different countries, and for the running book I lived and worked with Navajo people, and it was the same conversation again and again. I just think that when Ireland became an independent country, we were really involved in this stuff, and particularly in the League of Nations, but also, sorry, not the League of Nations, but the Commonwealth. But when we left the Commonwealth, we actually kind of left the role model position that we had. And in a strange way, we could have done more in the Commonwealth by talking about what was happening to some of these people, because we kind of opted out of that conversation. So it's an interesting one that I sometimes think about.
And it probably, we're heading up for another couple of years of centenaries, and certainly with Brexit kind of looming, I think it's like history can never, you can't just put it under the carpet, you know, it's always going to come back. It's like your own wounds or trauma in your own life or that of your family. They will always appear as ghosts or whispers, you know. Yeah. So I think they will happen by one way or the other, and such is the nature of perhaps the psychology or psyche of nations. So we're in for interesting times, but I mean that's true of all the world. And we take ecology and climate change. I'm just wondering about you as a farmer, what your sense of land is, and nature and ecology, and particularly from that indigenous, like essentially you're an indigenous man yourself, like you're,
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, I often think of that. We're an indigenous culture, and that's why I suppose our language and cultural practices are so important. And of course the dilution of them as well.
But you in particular as a farmer, you know, when we were growing up, like half our school and our mates were farmers and the other half thought they were somehow more sophisticated or whatever. But we'd always refer to each other or others, or be called muck savages, you know. And even the word savage, you know, savage off the land.
No. No, I mean, you know, land is, well, in this country it's very deep, but it's becoming it's a huge talking point now. I mean, how we farm, how we look after the land, how we are the custodians to it, and are we allowing it to heal properly in places where it has been deeply affected. And I think, you know, as a nation, we're still a very rural-based society. We're very like New Zealand, I suppose, in that respect. It's an agriculture-based economy to a large extent, and but we also have to look at the future of farming in this country, and what does that mean? And I suppose sometimes in writing the Cowbook, I became this poster boy for farming in Ireland. And I was always very aware of what I was saying and what I was doing in that space, because I don't agree with the intensification model of farming that is being sort of proposed in terms of like the intensification of dairy and things like that, because it's placing huge demands on land, on animals, and then on people. And I suppose it's the people thing that kind of interests me, because farming at the end of the day is a people business. It's not just an animal business. And I remember being at a conference for a farming group a number of years ago, and talking with this leading veterinarian surgeon, who was telling me about how I needed to expand my business and all this sort of stuff, and this was the way forward. And I turned around to her after half an hour of her talking, and I said, "What if you're happy with what you're doing?" And she said to me, she looked at me for a moment and she said, "Well, there's always weirdos, you know." And I just thought, you know, that there's a problem there. Like, you know,
what's the measurement?
What's the measurement? You know, the guy who had 30 cattle a number of years ago, decades ago, he was able to live and feed his family. Now he has to have 50 to 60. If you're a dairy farmer, the magic number is to get to 100 cattle at the moment. And you're doing the same amount of, you're doing more work for, in many cases, the same amount of money.
Yeah.
So it's a huge question, and I think we have to be asking these questions now about how we farm in order to, I suppose, protect the industry and the land, because ultimately we're just passing through the land, and that's probably, it's an indigenous belief, but it's a real belief. You know, as farmers, you're just passing through. It's your job to take care of the land, to provide food for yourself and a living for yourself, and the system of agriculture that we have at the moment for beef farmers doesn't provide a living because of certain controlling factors, namely beef barons and cabals. And so that's a conversation that has to be had. And also, if we look at COVID and the rights of migrant workers, farming has a dark shadow that's part of it. And that's something that really, that's a global conversation that I've been looking at. I was in America in February, documenting migrant worker experiences in America and in agriculture. And, you know, I didn't really need to go to the other side of the world to see it, did I? It's right. It's happening right here.
You think it's emerged as another dirty little secret from Ireland?
Yeah, well, it has. I mean, we've known that we needed migrant workers for certain sectors, particularly in the beef processing sector. But I honestly believe that most farmers themselves didn't know what the treatment of the workers were and the conditions they were working in. And people like Ella McSweeney have been documenting what has been happening. And, you know, it's interesting. A few weeks ago, we had a lot of stuff about COVID, but Ella had actually reported on this in The Guardian months ago. So people are aware. But as to the larger picture, I don't think people knew. And certainly in beef factories or beef processing plants, people didn't know what the conditions were like in the plants. So it's something that we have to be conscious of, and also try and seek change, because these people don't have a voice. You know, that's the big thing. The migrant workers don't actually have a voice. It's not like they have a union that they're all part of. Most of them don't have union membership. They're working as private contractors for these companies, and it's a really difficult time for them.
When you're engaged in your own writing, John, how much of it do you feel is you, and how much do you feel is that responsibility for these people that having a platform, or you're trying to tell their story or advocate?
Well, I suppose I've been on this journey for 10 years now, where I have been writing 3 memoirs about my life, and making sense of my life since I left home to now, and in particular from 24 to 34. I'm 34 now, and I've wrote 3 memoirs to understand those years and what happened. And in the books, my prejudice for telling other people's stories just came into it naturally, or my predilection for it. But in terms of telling other people's stories, you know, it's funny, with journalism, stories have always fallen into my lap, and they come to me, and you have an opportunity or a choice then to actually act on them. And you know, with the migrant worker thing, I've wanted to do that for a little while, and it was actually thanks to Farm Aid, which is an organization that Willie Nelson is part of. They put me in contact with a group called the Rural Coalition in America, and they organized the whole trip. And I kind of said, I have an obligation to go and do this, because I have a platform as a farmer who's a writer, and I think that this could be helpful to other people. And, you know, I've wrote 3 books about myself. It's time I started talking about some other people.
Yeah. Can we go back to the last book, John? And like, it was, did you have any sense of how big a success it would be?
None at all. I mean, I came home in 2015, and I was in Australia promoting my first book, which never came out here, which was about the Celtic Tiger crash. And I said to my then girlfriend, now wife, that I'd be back in a month. And it took 3 years, and I wrote 2 other books before I wrote the Cowbook. And actually, the Cowbook was my final attempt at being a writer, and I had pretty much thrown the kitchen sink at trying to be a writer, and other things, journalism and documentary making, had come to me quite easily, and this was like really hard, and it wasn't working, and I'd invested a lot of time into it, and the first book, The Ghost Estate, had been a flop, and I was just kind of saying to myself, look, I've spent years trying to be a writer, like this is it. And I poured literally my heart and soul into the Cowbook, and yeah, the success was kind of mind blowing. I had daydreamed about it, like I had thought this would be wonderful if this happened, and I think it was when I heard about the Late Late that I kind of said to myself, okay, this could potentially work. And then, you know, luck also has a huge part in it, because the Beast from the East hit, and I was booked on the show that night, and everyone in the country was watching live TV to find out what was happening. So I had an audience of 1 million people, and you couldn't ask really for a better introduction to to Ireland, you know. So, and people still comment to me about that interview. So I never. It spent 37 weeks in the bestseller list. I thought 1 week would be great, but it just spread, and it was a word of mouth thing. And I suppose I've been helping a friend who's a writer in Australia to get a book deal, and he got one. And he asked me for advice a long time ago, and I said, just be authentic. I said, that's what people want. He was writing a non-fiction book as well. And really, the Cowbook was me being authentic and talking. No, there was no other ulterior motive. I was talking about my life and the good and the bad part of it, and that connected with people. And I think in an unreal world, authenticity is a really rare commodity. And if we had more authentic conversations, the world would be a better place. So I suppose that was the thing I can put it down to. I put a lot of work into the book, and I was lucky, but I think it was just being real. People connected with that.
Yeah.
You know?
And do you think you hadn't achieved that authenticity before at that level? You think you were contriving and striving?
Well, as a young 20-year-old, I was very ambitious, and I was ambitious as a journalist. I was ambitious as a documentary maker. I was ambitious as a director. But I went on a journey at 25 to about 29, and that journey was an inward journey, and it was kind of spurred on by mental health issues. And in coming to face myself, I started to then question, well, why was I trying to succeed at this other stuff? And I was trying to succeed at all this other stuff so I'd be liked by people, because I didn't like myself. And ultimately, when I had that conversation with me, I started to then come to a point of, and it wasn't easy, but coming to a point of self-love and self-acceptance. And my writing till then hadn't really connected with the heart. And I think because I hadn't connected with my own heart, and I think that's where, you know, it's interesting. In Aboriginal culture in Australia, they say it takes 10 years to be a man or a woman, and this journey I've been on with these 3 books was the journey into adulthood. And it's amazing, you know. I was all my 20s trying to look for success, and then when I stopped, when I was being me, that's when the success came. And that's a really weird thing, but it's exactly what happens.
It's not uncommon though, is it?
No, it's not uncommon. It's really strange, you know. And I see it happening with my friend Oliver at the moment, the writer I mentioned. And you know, I think people are gravitated towards acceptance and truth, and when they see that someone is doing that, it really captures you. And because it's sort of like it's not like you've figured out a secret, because there's no secret, but it's that you've kind of have a contentment with yourself. And people want to know a little bit about how does that work for you, because ultimately it's a me question. How do I make it work for me then, you know?
And what did that inner journey look like for you, John? Did it involve therapy, or religion, or where did you end up? Like everything.
Everything. Religion. I went to faith healers. I went to modern healers.
Well, you were in a bad way.
I'd had a full and total breakdown.
Okay.
And, I'd closed a business in Australia, fallen out with a lot of people.
Okay.
And had come home in a really bad way.
Were you when you say you were a highly ambitious young man, like a 20, 24, you were winning awards, was there a kind of ego thing?
Oh, there was massive ego.
You
ego.
were kind of dangerous in a way, like.
Looking back on it, I really was. I mean, I'd had, when you get everything you want really young, you don't know what to do with it. And there was a lot of energy around me that attracted other people in. And then the energy stopped because the mental health wasn't good. And really I had to kind of, go on this like vision quest journey to, and I use the word vision quest in the Native American sense to find out what the message is, and it was not good. It was not good at all. But ultimately, I think my life imploded, and I had to figure out a new way of living, and writing was part of that, and coming back to the land was part of that, and coming back to Ireland was part of that. But there was no guidebook, no map, and so it was a really thankfully I had the support of my family, which was great, and I know a lot of people don't have that when they have mental health difficulties. So that was a really good thing, but it was it was a real journey, and it really ended when I was on the Ryan Tubridy show, and I was talking about my experience, and there was a man on his way to take his life, and he heard me speak, and he decided not to, and based on what I had said on the radio. And ultimately for me, spiritually, I said to myself that I was meant to go on this journey, because if I hadn't have done exactly what I'd done, this person would be dead, and I wouldn't have learned myself. And that was kind of the turning point in my life, and it's when I started living my life from the inside out, and things just made sense, and gradually they got better. And I still think about this stuff, and I was finishing the last book in the trilogy, and I only finished it 2 weeks ago, and it was really about it was the end of that journey, that 10-year cycle. And it was the hardest book I've ever wrote, because I was, in a sense, putting the past in the past. And in putting the past in the past, you are closing a chapter and saying, those memories, those events, they've served me, but now I need to let them live in the past. And it brought a huge thinking pattern and conversation internally about, well, what is the past and what is memory, and why is it the past, we can't see it, we can't hold it, it exists in our minds, and yet it determines how we interpret the world. And so I had to say that that interpretation now needed to end. And it was a really transformative experience writing those books. And it was a really, the Cowbook was about coming to peace with this new life, and the running book has been about the enjoyment of life. And the new one, the one won't be out for 2 years, but that one has been about saying goodbye. So it's a really, it's been a weird 10 years. So all you can do is laugh, But
Well, you haven't been idle, that's for sure, and you have something to show for it, And you've besides the books, you have a smile on your face, so that's
the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So what can people expect now with the running book? And we're excited to find out what happened next kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, the Cowbook was about just our farm and a small acreage and one family. And the running book is about, I suppose, expanding that view. And I go for a marathon run around North Longford, where I'm from. But in it, really, I'm exploring the DNA of this place that I call home and the history of it, and and how the local, it's like you said at the start of our program and our chat, how the local becomes universal, and how in a sense the book is about how one place can be every place, and that everywhere is rich with story and history. And ultimately then it is a book about how joy came for me through the simple act of running. But ultimately, I suppose I want people to read the book and think about how do they find joy in the present moment through some act. It could be walking, it could be swimming, it could be meditation. Like it's about the conscious. It's about the conscious movement and the conscious decision to. You see, joy and happiness are for so many people they're unattainable because they don't actually put in the work to get them. You have to become active to be happy. It's like that laughing therapy or smiling therapy. You have to smile to, and eventually you start to feel happy. But really, in my experience, we have to work at happiness. It's not a continuum state. It's not something that you have all the time. And when you come from the journey that I've been on with mental health difficulties and depression, you appreciate happiness. So I work at happiness, and I want people to kind of, when they read the book, to have that moment of inner reflection and say, am I making me happy? Because so often in our lives there's the musts and the shoulds, and we are I must do this, I have to do this, but I can't join you in going for a walk because I must do this thing. But a lot of the time those musts and shoulds are actually other people's wishes for you to do, whether it's I need to get this report done, I need to get this done. I'm not talking about, people don't need to skive off work, but it's actually about making the time for you that you must. And you know, I kind of experimented on this with my mother, funnily enough. But she runs a preschool, and it's a Montessori school, and it's a busy place, and there's about 100 kids there. And I kind of got her into going for a walk every day, and she's been doing it for 5 years now. And she says to me that she said, first of all, she said, you've added a number of years to my life by getting me into this habit.
Yeah.
But she said, most importantly, she said, I make the time for me. At first, it was a chore, and now she says that's the best part of my day because I have time to reflect on what has happened, what I'm going to do, and I've made time to be me. And I think for me that's running, but I think we all need to have that conversation about making your time, because we live in a world that is, even in a pandemic world, that is constricted by time, and we have to make the space for us to find our present moment and our joy. You know, Pheidippides, when he ran the first marathon, he died after it, but the first thing he said was joy. He was talking about the battle of marathon that they'd won. But joy is the thing that we all have to be aware of, and we all have to work at. It doesn't just come out of the sky. And take it from a guy who's been through the worst of life, joy is something you have to work at. So for me, it's putting on a pair of running shoes and going for a run every day.
John, it seems like a great note to end on the message of joy at this time. So listen, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, and I really appreciate it. I'm excited to read the book, and I wish you every success with it. And more importantly, I hope you just keep on running and keep on smiling.
Thanks, Rory. It's really nice to be here today, and love the podcast. So it's great to be on it.
Good man. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for checking out that episode of the Love and Courage podcast. If you enjoyed it, as I did, please do share, let other people know about it, and do check out the archive of other Love and Courage podcast episodes available on all the main podcast apps. Check out John Connell's book, The Running Book, and check out my book, Hitching for Hope, a journey into the heart and soul of Ireland. You can find out more at hitchingforhope.com. It's available in all the main bookstores, on various websites, ebook, audiobook, print, you name it. And if you're interested in hosting a talk or collaborating around a talk, a workshop, and an event through Zoom or live stream or otherwise, please do get in touch. info@hitchingforhope.com, info@hitchingforhope.com. And if you want to chip in to support the podcast, just jump over to loveandcourage.org. Once-off and monthly patronage, all appreciated and supported, but never any pressure. And really appreciate your time, your ears, your attention, your support. Until next time, thanks for tuning in. Lots of love. Mind yourself. Bye-bye.